what you're learning today, and this is not the full list. We're going to talk about Windows Server on-premise, we're going to talk about Windows Server in Azure, and we're going to talk about Windows Server and bring your own license to any other providers, which I forgot to put on this slide. Everything about Windows Server. Therefore, it's not a very long training, and if we don't get a lot of live questions today, which I'm not, let me check the comments, which there aren't that many yet, then we'll probably be quite quick and finish it in about 6 minutes. Should be nice. I will start with a disclaimer. So this is the actual training now. I will start with a disclaimer. We are not Microsoft. So everything related to Microsoft is copyright Microsoft. The rest is copyright us, all our advice. This is all our practical advice. This is what we face and our clients face as practical challenges. This is our way to implement how we do things and how we think that the things need to be done. And sometimes what we notice is that even Microsoft watches these videos and learns from us, and then some of the most critical nodes, they add into new licensing guides. For example, we keep repeating that a license pack is not a single license. Now it's part of the frequently asked questions in the official Microsoft guide. They actually say that the license pack is not a single license and it's breakable. So before that, it was us having this on our flag. Now Microsoft confirmed it. Is it good? Yeah. Everybody benefits from it except for dodgy salespeople. Always, whatever advice we give you, always look it up in Microsoft product terms. Here's the link, microsoft.com/licensing/terms. Always look it up there. Whatever advice you get from us or anywhere else, unless you found evidence in that document, or sometimes in licensing guides, but better in this document, it may be wrong. And for those of you who are watching, please type in the chat, what's the oldest Windows Server version that runs in your estate? And we'll continue, we'll move on. So the current version of Windows Server is 2022. The previous versions, and please do not confuse versions and editions. Even Google does it, and really annoying. You ask Google about versions, it returns editions and vice versa. They are not the same things. So for books and movies, maybe, not for software. In software, there are very strict terms. Versions are numbers. Editions are the size of the package, the cost of the package, the features packed in that package. It's like think about the cars. So if you know Mercedes-Benz, they have this, 221, 219, and in that range, they have, say, luxury, classical, minimal configurations, options. So these are the editions. Standard and data center. Standard is almost 1/7 of the price of data center. So that it's more related to cost than versions. And if somebody asks you for the edition of your Windows Server machine, do not respond with 2022 because it's a wrong answer. The right answer is data center, standard, or essentials. So these are the current editions. So Windows Server is one of the products that has rights to so-called down edition. So any volume license, any license you procure through volume channels, except for the ones that come with your servers, which are called OEM licenses, they're not volume licenses. So all the licenses you buy normally as an organization, they have built-in downgrade rights. So you can downgrade them to any previous version, really. You buy a current license, which is Windows Server 2022, and you may install, for example, Windows Server NT 3.5 if you want to. It's possible. You're allowed to. Down editions are a bit trickier. So normally, the reason they're called down editions is that you kind of use the Windows Server Data Center license because you have it and you're not using it, and you deploy Windows Server Standard, and you may use a higher edition license to license that machine. But you cannot do vice versa, with one recent exception. We'll talk about it. All the down edition paths are on this slide with the arrows, so you can figure it out. An interesting exception is if you still use Windows Server Enterprise virtual machines and you need to reshuffle licenses around. Please remember that current Windows Server standard licenses cover previous Windows Server Enterprise virtual machines. That edition does not exist any longer, but you may do that. You may cover it this way. Just a quick sound check. Yeah, everything seems to be working well. As I told you, there is the current new exception, and from this point on, if anything is flagged yellow on the slides, it means that it's a recent change. That's what we do, color coding. So we highlight several words, sometimes with orange or blue. When it's yellow, it means that's a recent change, and please pay attention if you know Windows Server licensing, if you learned it from our previous training, which we did in 2021, so almost 2 years ago. It was September 2021. There are new things. Microsoft made 2 changes recently, one in October 2022, the other one is in April 2023. All of these are reflected in this training, in these slides. So only for subscription licenses in CSP, no other licenses, not through enterprise agreement, not through MPSA, not through Open, not through SPLA. You can have a virtual machine with Windows Server Datacenter in the virtual machine and assign to it Windows Server standard licenses per virtual machine. We'll talk about the rules in a few slides. So this is unique. Not really, because that's what Microsoft allows to do in Azure, which again, we'll talk about in a few slides. In Azure, the addition of the license doesn't matter. The rules are exactly the same. Whether a virtual machine is with a server data center or a standard, how much, what's the size of that package that is installed in the VM really doesn't matter for Azure hybrid use benefits, for bringing your own licenses into Azure. Microsoft, to align on-premises licensing with Azure to make it more kind of fairer, they also allowed it, but only on virtual machines, not on the hardware, and only through the CSP channel. Don't ask me why. I'm actually baffled why suddenly, for the first time, enterprise agreement clients are getting lesser benefits than CSP clients. This is the first precedent. It's never happened before. This is a precedent. The licensing model is essentially per core plus client access licenses, except for Windows Server Essentials, but very few people use Essentials. We have a slide about Windows Server Essentials. So Windows Server Data Center and Standard, the 2 editions that are responsible for 99% of all the installations across the world, they are licensed per core plus some form of a client access license. And access to Windows Server is always licensable. If you just purchase Windows Server licenses and install them, say, on your server somewhere in your office, it's not yet licensed. So the server itself is, but you may not use it because your users or devices will require client access licenses. If you want to learn more about client access licenses, this is something I shouldn't forget to put in the description, but you can still find it in the same playlist on our channel. Firstly, we have a dedicated video on the channel just about CALs. Secondly, please watch the first part of the 2022-2023 season of our training, which is Microsoft Licensing Basics. I explained there on multiple slides how client access licenses work. So for those of you who know, I repeat, CALs are always required. CALs are always required. The licensing metric is processor core, and let's just recap what those licensing metrics are. I did the same in the initial session, but it always makes sense to remind you what licensing metrics are, because we get people on these trainings who have no idea sometimes what a processor is. So inside every computer there's a CPU, the processor. And when licensing started many years ago, like say mid-90s, even before that, they were simply computers, just computers, with one processor. First servers had one processor, and licenses were as well just per processor. And that's what traditional Windows Server was many years ago. I think, like, if you think about Windows Server 2000 or Windows Server NT, they were licensed per server. And how do you scale that? If you need more workloads, you just buy new servers. And thus, vendors like Microsoft, they can sell you more licenses. You know, you have more servers. Well, please give us your money because you want to use our software, more servers. So you just needed to multiply it by the number of servers. At some point, hardware manufacturers started installing multiple CPUs into the same servers. So you don't need as many servers. And software vendors, not only Microsoft, Oracle, and others, they said, well, we're losing revenue. The same company used to pay us for 6 servers. Now they're only paying us for 4, like in this picture. How about we start charging them per processor? So they started charging per processor. Then progress doesn't stop there. And certain minimums could be required. For example, Windows Server 2008 required at least 2 processor licenses per server, even if you had 1. So progress did not stop there, and Intel and AMD and other processor vendors, they decided, you know what, let's not put multiple processors in the server. Let's not put like 32 processors in the server because it's just physically impossible. Let's pack kind of processors into the same processor chip, and they call them cores. Each core is essentially like, well, it's a fraction of a processor. It's almost like a standalone processor. So that's how we get cores. Inside one processor, there are multiple cores. 4, 8, 20, there are now processors with 200 cores, for example. So vendors look at that and said, oh, they're now scaling by including processor cores. We're losing revenue. So let's charge them per core. And this, since, so for SQL Server, that changed in 2012. For Windows Server, it changed in 2016 when Microsoft switched licensing to per core. And therefore, now you need to you just don't need 1 license per server. You need to calculate the number of cores, and you also need to apply certain minimum licensing requirements per processor and per server, which we'll discuss in just a few slides from now. And the last thing I'd like to mention now is that virtual machines have virtual cores, which are representations of hardware cores. And usually virtual machine licensing per core is per virtual core inside the virtual machine. And if you don't know what a virtual machine is, we will mention it later in some of the following slides in the training. So, moving on. How do you calculate licenses? And here I need to make another comment, which is a big update from Microsoft. It was introduced in October last year. Now we have 2 licensing models for Windows Server. The traditional one, I will probably call it traditional, is per host. So up until October last year, Windows Server could only be licensed per hardware host. There were no formulas, no rules per virtual machine. So licenses would always have to be dependent on the number of physical cores and physical processors. And no, not so Rasmus, thank you for your question, not per hyperthread. So current Windows Server doesn't really care about hyperthreads. It sort of does, but I haven't seen yet a hypervisor that would map 2 hyperthreads to a single core. If you know such a hypervisor, please type it in the chat. VMware, Nutanix, Hyper-V, if you enable hyperthreading on the processors and reboot the server, each vCore will be mapped to 1 thread. So all these multipliers that Microsoft does mention in product terms, they don't apply to popular hypervisors. I was told that in Azure you can configure it this way. When multiple hardware threads support 1 virtual core, in that case, only in virtual machines, you need to count physical threads supporting virtual cores. It's a bit complicated, but as I said, it's an exception. It's less than 1%. So it's all per core. So at the hardware level, if you use, for example, if you use licenses, and this is important, if you use licenses pre-2022 or 2022, but without software assurance or subscription, so-called perpetual licenses, or some people call them license only. Those licenses are still only calculated per host, per piece of hardware. So this is how you calculate it. So you count all the physical CPUs, step number one. Say we have 2 CPUs. Then you count physical cores in one CPU. And then you assign licenses following the following 2 rules. At least 8 licenses per CPU and at least 16 licenses per the entire host or a server or a blade. And for those of you who are Excel geeks, at the bottom of the slide, there, which way? This way. There's an Excel formula. Just basically just use pause this video, type it in Excel, and here we go. This is how you calculate the licenses. Now, since Windows Server 2022, and this is a big change, now we can license Windows Server per virtual machine. Well, not really Windows Server 22 plus flexible virtualization benefits. So these are the new rules. You can calculate licenses at the virtual machine level, and you need to assign at least 8 licenses per virtual machine, or a container with Hyper-V isolation, which is essentially just a small virtual machine. It's the same as VM. It's just, technically it's a VM. And the Excel formula is here on the slide as well, which is, you can see, it's very simple. You just count the vCores and then assign at least 8. But what you need to remember about the per VM licensing, and I will mention this again, Microsoft simplified it in October. This is the first rule on the slide. The second rule is both licenses themselves and all the client access licenses must be either subscription licenses or licenses with active software assurance. So you must pay some recurring fee, some OPEX, if I may, to Microsoft to benefit from per virtual machine licensing. And not only that, Microsoft completely changed the rules of the game for Windows Server in October, making SA and subscription licenses much more attractive than they used to be. Before that, I would normally say, if you have a big estate, just don't buy your licenses with SA, or why would you need it? Now, there are benefits. So how do you purchase core licenses? So you count them always in single cores. The thing is, this is a big point that I was almost on crusade against salespeople saying there are 16 core licenses, there are 8 core licenses. Microsoft themselves, so don't even attempt to argue with me. Microsoft themselves clarified it in the Windows Server licensing FAQ. They answer there clearly that the license pack can be split into single licenses. It's just a purchasing vehicle. You just buy it as a package, as a pack of batteries. I have a pack of batteries here somewhere. I usually show them, on these live shows, but it really doesn't matter. So if somebody tells you that, no, you may not break a 16-core pack, they call it usually 16-core license, between multiple virtual machines or multiple servers, yes, you can. Yes. So what's important, though, let's forget about that. Microsoft said you can do that. There's no reason to argue with Microsoft. The only point here is, when you see calculations performed by salespeople or some of the software asset management people, some of the licensing people, they sometimes, for reasons that elude me, they calculate quantities in 2 core packs. I always advise, do all the calculations, all the compliance calculations in single cores first. Then when it comes to calculating how much you need to pay for it, then you can ask your resellers to kind of do their magic and pack them into 16 core packs, 8 core packs, 2 core packs as a second stage. Do the calculations in single cores. If you received an outsider calculation, ask them whether that's in single cores or in core packs. Well, because you accidentally can pay twice. You can pay double cost, which, well, you want to avoid, obviously. So, yeah, this is basically the slide that I just mentioned. I won't stop on it. Couple of examples, just so you understand the minimum. The minimum 8 per CPU, minimum 16 per server. So with the modern day servers, really, it really doesn't. There are almost always more than 16 cores in the server with the modern servers. I don't remember a server in the last like 4 years, I think, which would have less than 16 cores. But there are still legacy servers in use everywhere, on providers, on premise, in small data centers, in server rooms, and they may still have things like one processor server. So on this picture, the server on top only has one processor with one core. It still requires 16 licenses. On the second picture, there are two processors. Each processor has 4 cores. It still requires 16 licenses. More interestingly, I see still sometimes legacy servers with 4 CPUs. Those servers, although they only have 4 cores in total, they require 32 core licenses, because remember, each processor requires 8 core licenses. So you multiply it by 4, you get 32. Simple as that. So virtualization, for those of you who don't know, and again, we have to cater for those who don't know certain computer terms like processor or virtualization, especially for those people who are, say, in procurement, and they're not IT people. So what is virtualization? Basically, a virtual machine, a virtual layer, is a pretend computer running inside the physical computer. So there's a hardware box with an operating system. Inside it, you can install software called hypervisor, in which you can create pretend hardware boxes, which are not hardware boxes. That's why they're called virtual. And to the operating system and the software inside, they will look like a normal computer, and that is called virtual machine. So it's like a computer that is not a physical computer inside a physical computer, and you can have multiple virtual machines running on one physical computer, which is what all the companies do with servers these days, and not only servers sometimes. So, and the hardware layer is also called a host sometimes. So virtual machines and containers. What we need to remember that Datacenter edition license, when it's assigned to the host, to the physical layer, because it's always assigned, you would normally do that, gives you right to run unlimited number of virtual machines and containers. It's truly unlimited. No requirements, no like software assurance or anything. It's just truly unlimited. You assign data center licenses to the hardware level, to the hardware layer, to the host, and you can run as many virtual machines and containers as you please, as hardware permits, really. With standard edition, when you license it in the traditional way, so pre-2022 licenses or licenses without software assurance, standard edition, if you assign them to the physical layer, you may run up to 2 virtual machines in that case. Only standard edition. That's the traditional rules of licensing. If you need more, you need to stack them, so add more licenses, and we have a slide about it, just a few slides after. But now, if you have a current license with software assurance or on a subscription, you may also decide to license virtual machines per virtual machine. You may even completely, if you use, for example, VMware at the host level, you may completely skip licensing the host and just license individual virtual machines. And on massive servers, like I saw a server recently with 256 cores and just a few VMs, that was essentially so cheaper to license that per virtual machine, so it's a no-brainer. And the company paid for the licenses with software assurance anyway. So that was a massive cost-saving exercise to switch to a new licensing model. You need to count containers with Hyper-V isolation if you use them, because they're essentially virtual machines. Containers without Hyper-V isolation do not count, because they're containers. They're not virtual machines. It's strange naming in the Windows Server ecosystem, But those of you who manage licenses, please remember, again, containers with Hyper-V isolation require licenses as normal virtual machines. And we have an article about it on SAMexpert.com, and we have a video or even a couple of videos here on this channel that talk about the same thing. There's an exception which I mentioned, downgrades and down editions, only for subscriptions and CSP. I mentioned it already, but because we're talking about per VM licensing, so I remind you, only CSP subscription licenses benefit from it, no other kind of license does. You may license Windows Server data center virtual machines per VM with Windows Server standard licenses. Only through CSP, subscription required, all the client access licenses must be licensed as subscriptions or a say, but there is such a possibility. It's new, it's mind-boggling, but again, it's another cost avoidance measure, which I can only say thank you for. I mentioned license stacking. If you need to add more machines in the traditional per host licensing with Windows Server standard licenses, if you have fewer than 7 virtual machines which you license with Windows Server, or fewer than 4 virtual machines which you license with Core Infrastructure Suite bundle, which we'll mention in the end of this training, you may actually save money, but only on standalone hosts. It doesn't work in clusters. You may save money by stacking Windows Server standard licenses. So for example, to run 7 virtual machines of Windows Server Standard, you may decide to either license the host with Windows Server Data Center licenses, or you may also decide to assign a set of standard licenses 4 times. One caveat though, do not mix versions. So the version of the license must always be the same. You cannot assign, say, 32 cores of Windows Server 2016 licenses and 32 Windows Server 2019 core licenses. That Microsoft doesn't allow that. It's nonsensical. I don't like it. I actually hate it that they do so, but they don't allow you mixing versions, which I don't think it's fair. But it's Microsoft. It's their software. It's their rules. What you need to do is what's written on this slide. So count all the virtual machines and containers with Hyper-V isolations. If you use host operating system for anything else except Hyper-V, for example, you run some sort of management software or SQL Server on the host itself as well, then you need to add +1, because then that operating system is licensable too, together with the VMs. Then you divide the resulting result by 2, and then round it up, and then multiply it by the required core licenses. But it's a long story. There's an Excel formula on this slide, which you can again pause, copy, paste in your Excel. There you go. That is the formula. So, if you're still watching it and you like what's going on here, please click like. If you don't like it, please leave a comment. In addition to clicking dislike, please really leave a comment, because we want to understand what is it that you don't like. Maybe we're missing something, so we can add another video. Maybe the delivery is not clear enough, so we can make it clearer next time. Please leave a comment. So, a little bit of a teaching moment again. So what are virtual clusters? So virtual clusters are groups of hosts. And this is how modern day virtualization works anyway. If somebody virtualizes Windows Server or Windows 10, any other software in virtual machines, usually those virtual machines will be combined in so-called clusters. Why? Well, for resilience, for protection from failures. And virtual machines, they usually move around the clusters like this. It's called virtual machine mobility. And in this exercise, when machines move like this, because Microsoft licenses, even when they're calculated per virtual machine, they still assign to hosts, unless you play by specific rules, which we'll mention now. This, what just happened, created a non-compliant situation when two licenses are still assigned to the host number 1, and host number 3 doesn't have enough licenses. So what can you do about that? If you have software and in this case, we're talking about Windows Server, which is license only, without software assurance or without subscription, perpetual licenses without software assurance or subscription, license only, then in that case, licenses may only move following virtual machines only once in 90 days. So machine moved, the license must still stay on the other host, and that is non-compliant. How do you avoid that? Before October 2022, there was almost no way to do so. So you had to license every host for the potential worst case scenario of all the machines suddenly running on a single host. I know it probably would not happen in real life, but that's what they required. Now, with a SAO subscription, it's an equivalent of, if you know that term, the benefit is called flexible virtualization, not license mobility, but it's a full equivalency of what you used to know as license mobility. So licenses are mobile. Licenses may move with the virtual machine. And what you can do in a software like Flexera or Snow, when you manage your licenses, you just assign those licenses. Just remember that when they say expires, you need to unassign them. But you may assign them in Flexera or Snow to virtual machines. Legally, so this is a bit complicated. From the licensing point of view, you cannot assign them to VMs, but from the license management practical point of view, in the tool, this is what many do when the license has license mobility rights or flexible virtualization rights from October 2022. You may assign it in the tool. You may assign it to a virtual machine. You may not assign a license without software assurance to a virtual machine, ever. Not in the tool, never. But if it has a say, if it's a current version, but what you need to remember is that to be compliant, all the client access licenses must also be covered with a say or subscription. There's no exception. So if you decide to switch to per VM licensing model, remember that you may have to upgrade all your CALs, unless you're paying for them with software assurance, or you get them through a so-called equivalency through, for example, Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 subscriptions. Then in that case, you need to repurchase your client access licenses with software assurance to benefit from these things. Virtual clusters again. So data center is as per host again. If you assign it to the host cluster level, host level, physical level, then you have unlimited virtualization and machines may move around whenever, and you don't even need a say. Standard edition per host, the traditional model, not per VM, the traditional per host license really makes little sense in clusters. It only makes sense if your cluster has fewer than 7 Windows Server virtual machines. So we do see this often, by the way, almost in every client, almost in every infrastructure. There's like a little cluster somewhere in the DMZ with, say, 20 Linux machines and 4 Windows Server machines, and they move around. That cluster is cheaper to license with Windows Server standard licenses. Always. What we advise is, if you think about licensing per machine, then use the new per VM rules. But remember, they require software assurance or subscription. Combining, this is a frequently asked questions these days, combining traditional per host licenses for versions prior to 2022 and current per VM licensing using licenses with software assurance for Windows Server 2022 is permitted, actually. You can mix and match that. Just be careful that use legacy rules for legacy software, use new rules for new software, and you should be fine. There's no official answer to that question, but people who say this, like Louis Ulrich, for example, there's a massive reason to trust those people. And I quote them. If they didn't say so, I would probably be very, very cautious about advising anything like it. So client access licenses, as I said, Windows Server is not licensed if access isn't licensed, unless there are exceptions. So there are exceptions, but normally the rule of the thumb is access licenses are required. There are what you need to remember also, that client access licenses are dependent on other licenses, again, unless there are exceptions. If, for example, you deploy a service on your premises, or you rent hardware from a provider, you rent hardware, but you still use your own licenses, and you need to give your users access to a terminal to run Office, for example, on that server, you need remote desktop services calls, RDS calls. And if you need RDS calls, it automatically requires these users to be licensed with Windows Server Cal 2. Same applies to Active Directory Rights Management Services calls, which are less frequently used. I think the RDS example is frequent, almost, well, every company I know uses RDS calls, except for one, and I'm talking about hundreds. If you need RDS calls, you usually always need Windows Server calls as well. Same dependencies apply to external connectors. So external connectors, important thing about the external connectors is that external connectors apply, they are assigned to hosts. So if calls are assigned to users that consume with the server, directly or indirectly, or their devices, because there are also device calls, external connectors are always assigned per host. External connectors have flexible, what's it called? License mobility and flexible virtualization. So external connectors, if you acquire them with with a SAY or a subscription, they may move around with the virtual machine to which you provide external access. Let me give you an example, because it becomes complicated, because people ask me, like, what is external access? If you provide access to that server to somebody who's not your employee, contractor, supply, on-site provider, the best example would be you run a web server on a Windows Server platform. So you have a Windows Server that hosts a web server that you publish to the internet. In that case, that web server, because it runs on Windows Server, requires an external connector license for all the external users, in addition to internal calls for your own employees and contractors. So web server is the best example when you require an external connector. I talked about the dependencies. Here's the slide with the dependencies. I'll just leave it on the slide, just to remind you that when you require an RDS call, you also require Windows Server call. There are exceptions. So as I said, unless there are exceptions, and here are the exceptions. So Windows Server calls are not required in Azure. So any workloads, bring your own license, Azure Hybrid benefit, pay as you go, whichever method you use to license Windows Server in Azure, Windows Server calls are not required on that platform. On CSP hosters, so there's a very small subset of providers called CSP hosters, and until April they didn't have any benefits. Now since April they have this peculiar benefit. When you procure virtual machines from them, not through SPLA, it gets complicated, but really you won't get into that situation until it becomes complicated, so please bear with me. Not through SPLA, but through so-called CSP hosting program, when they resell you the licenses together with the virtual machines that you rent from them. Only in that case, only on CSP hosters, only with so-called license included services, you don't need Windows Server calls. You may, from October 2022, bring your own license to a service provider. And some providers are more and more open to that these days. When you do so, you still require calls. What's important here is that RDS and rights management calls are always required, including Azure, including CSP hosting with license included, anywhere. So there's no waiver for RDS calls. The only exception is admin connections, but let's not talk about it. We're talking about providing remote desktop service access to end users of your organization that always, everywhere requires RDS calls. And we have an article on our website, SAMexpert.com, that discusses that problem with Azure and how you solve it. We have a question, what is ADRMS? No idea. I don't use it. I know it exists. It's sort of, if I explain it in a lame way, it's sort of a right to, an ability to say this file can only be accessed by these people, only these people can edit it. It's difficult. Rights management to certain files. Please Google it. This training is not about features of Windows Server. This training is about licensing Windows Server. What's very important these days to remember, extremely important, otherwise you may listen to me and think, oh, by the way, we don't have Windows Server cards, let's rush and buy them. If your users licensed with EMS E3, E5, Microsoft 365 F1, F3, E3, E5, Core Enterprise CAL Intune Bridge, Core Enterprise CAL Office 365 plus Intune EMS Bridge. What's on this slide? Users that are assigned these licenses do not require separate Windows Server CALs. These CALs are sort of bundled with these Office Microsoft 365 subscriptions. There's a very tiny link on this slide, what you probably won't see if you're watching this from your phone right now. But if you go to Microsoft product terms, which I mentioned in the very beginning of this training, you can type there CAL equivalency, and it'll take you to the page. It's a very long page that lists every single client access license equivalency. And you can check whether your Microsoft 365 licenses, they should be on this list, because these are the majority of the packages. But you can double check that Windows Server CAL is included in your bundle. And in that case, that user does not require a separate CAL for Windows Server. What's important again to remember is that RDS and RMS CALs are not included in any of these packages, only basic Windows Server CAL. I need to mention quickly Windows Server Essential Edition. It is for small organizations. As far as I remember, this is an old slide. This is from September 2021. The Essentials Edition is still 2019. I may be wrong. Please correct me. I didn't update this slide today. There are lots of limitations. For example, domain trust is not permitted. One license is one instance. It's not per core. Windows Server CALs are not required. This is another exception. ADRMS CALs are required, and there's no remote desktop services role, so RDS CALs, you can't use them because there's no RDS role in Windows Server Essentials. You cannot provide RDS access to Windows Server Essentials. Azure Hybrid benefit. So let's talk about it, what it is. If your licenses have software assurance or a subscription, you can take them to Azure. And if you're not using this, and if you have such licenses and you are not using AHUB in Azure, I don't think, my question is what you're doing in your role, because you are missing on savings up to 80% in Azure on the license cost. So a Windows Server Standard licenses with a SAO subscription can be used either on premises or in Azure. And same applies to subscription licenses via CSP. And Windows Server Datacenter licenses through any channel, and since October 2022, also through CSP. This is why it's yellow. They may be used simultaneously on premises and in Azure. So if you're already paying for these licenses and you use them in your own data center, and they are on some kind of a subscription, you may, at the same time, go to Azure and using all the calculation rules, calculate how many VMs you can cover with these licenses and just tick a box there. I'm using my own license. And start saving now. Do this after this training. If you haven't done it yet, do it after you watch this training. You will immediately start saving money from day one. I'm looking at the questions very quickly. Does Azure Virtual Desktop follow the same rules you just explained? So if you're talking about AVD which is Windows 11, it does not require RDS CALs. It's Windows 11. It's not Windows Server. Regarding CALs included but TS CAL needed, AVD is it? You mean the AVD, which is a so-called shared AVD as a terminal server? Yes, it does require that. So what's important to answer this question? Try and simplify this. If the underlying technology is Windows Server, then these rules apply, whatever the service is. Do you get it? It's important. So, a Windows Server standard in Azure, there is a dual use right, but only for 180 days. So if you're migrating something from on-premises to Azure, Microsoft does not have dual use rights otherwise, like at all. So if you, for example, if you deploy the new infrastructure and you're migrating machines from the old infrastructure to the new infrastructure, you actually have to pay for both infrastructures, even for the fraction of time when you're migrating them. There is no allowance to, no exception. You have to pay for it. When you're migrating to Azure, it's explicitly allowed for 180 days to continue using licenses on premises. After that 180 days, you need to decide whether you keep them on premises and start paying as you go on Azure, or you kill the on-premises instances, delete the machines, and you move the licenses fully to Azure. So after 180 days expired, it's a one-off opportunity. So it's not like you can't just move them back and forth. It's a one-off opportunity for Windows Server Standard licenses to be used simultaneously for 180 days. Windows Server Datacenter, as I mentioned, that is simultaneous use, no limitations. So how do you calculate licenses? Sorry, wait a second. Unless it's dedicated hosts. So when we're talking about VMs, it's simultaneous use. If you want to move licenses to Azure from your on-premises hosts to Azure dedicated hosts, then the same 180 days rule apply. So simultaneous use is only allowed for Azure virtual machines. So how do you calculate licenses in Azure? And it has been simplified. Minimum of 8 cores assigned to a virtual machine. No more 16 licenses minimum per client, which was always a ridiculous requirement. So you start with 8 cores. If you go to Azure Hybrid Benefit Calculator, it allows you to assign at least 8 VMs to Azure. There we go. If you need bigger VMs, you used to have to increment it by 8 cores. Now that requirement is removed. So if you have a 10-core virtual machine, you may assign 10 licenses to it now, to Azure. Very flexible. Really love it. And I hope, I keep my fingers crossed, that Microsoft will introduce, rumors are they will, 2 core packs in CSP. Because in CSP, you can only buy 8 core packs. So therefore, you still buy them in increments of 8. But remember what I said. You may split them. So if you run say 2 12-core virtual machines, you can assign 3 core packs because the total number of cores is 24. So you just need to buy 24 cores in 3 8-core packs and assign them to 2 virtual machines. They're splittable. Don't argue. Additions in Azure don't matter, really. So there are no multipliers, dividers, or whatever. It really doesn't matter what addition the license is. The rules are exactly the same, and it doesn't matter what the addition of the virtual machine is. Azure has advantages over other providers and other clouds. Whether they are fair or not, we'll leave it to European providers to discuss with Microsoft, which is happening right now. Licensing access in Azure, Windows Server CALs, I remind you, are not required. RDS client access licenses are required. You may use your own RDS CALs with a say or subscription, or you may rent RDS CALs from a hosting provider if that provider manages those Azure virtual machines for you. So they must be your outsourcer. You can't just buy those licenses. It's not permitted by SPLA. Interestingly, that external RDS access to Azure virtual machines is not permitted. So how do you license RDS access to an Azure virtual machine, normal Azure virtual machine? No idea, really. So I can't answer that question. I think Microsoft just doesn't want you to provide RDS access to Azure virtual machines, except with SALs. So if we're talking about service provider licensing through SPLA, then in that case, external access is just license per SAL. But with CSP and enterprise agreement licenses, you can only use them for internal use, RDP access. Windows Server in Amazon, Google, Alibaba, and Azure, in addition to AHUB, but honestly, just ignore it. Amazon, Google, and Alibaba. What you need to remember is if you pay for that server to the provider, and Google, by the way, does not really provide a dedicated hardware with licenses, but Amazon does. That's okay. It's all the same. So there's no bio. With bring your own licenses, it's complicated. So you may not bring Windows Server licenses to virtual machines, and on dedicated hardware, you may only bring Windows Server licenses if the initial license, even if you renew software assurance on it, if the initial license was purchased initially before the 1st of October 2019. It's really complicated. It's really complicated. It's possible, but it's complicated. Subscription licenses obviously just don't work for this. They are called listed providers. There's a list on the Microsoft website. That's why they're called listed. And if you want to learn more about it, browse the videos on this channel where we talk about that. And what we're going to have is, I think it's next month, we're going to have a dedicated training about licensing Microsoft software on AWS. So we're not covering Google or Alibaba in that one, just AWS. To be honest, AWS themselves publish really good material about how to license Microsoft software on AWS. It's probably even clearer than Microsoft's own guides. Big kudos to Amazon. Fantastic work, fantastic job done. So read that or come to our training in a month. So Rasmus is asking, I need to give external admins RDP access to Windows Server in Azure under CSP. Does that not work? So, don't give them RDP access. There are two roles in Windows Server that allow remote desktop access. There's the always enabled by default remote administration mode, and there's remote desktop access, remote desktop services. If the admins only use remote desktop administration and RDP role is not enabled and they are not part of the RDP group, then CALs are waived for that access. CALs are not required. So you have two simultaneous connections. There are actually three, the /console, but two simultaneous connections to the remote desktop administration that do not require RDS, CALs, or SALs. So if those people are truly admins, and you never go above the two simultaneous connections, then just forget about RDP SALs, CALs. I hope it makes sense. If you make them members of the RDP user group, then they become your suppliers, if they're external admins. They become your suppliers, they treat it as your employees. So you just need to buy normal CALs for them. When I say external access, it means like you cannot publish a desktop application for, say, for your partners. You have partners that are retail stores and they're logging into your ERP that for some reason is still a traditional, not a web app, and you run it in a desktop. That's not allowed in Azure. You may still do this on-premise or on a hosted solution. Okay, so Windows Server in other service providers. So not Amazon, not Google, not Alibaba, and not even Azure. When you, so what you can do, what you cannot do. So pay-as-you-go, obviously pay-as-you-go is provided everywhere. Virtual machines or hardware dedicated. Can you bring your own licenses to other providers? And when I say other providers, that is Aruba, OVH, Servers.com, Rackspace, GoDaddy, whichever else you can think of, DigitalOcean, massive provider, OVH, massive provider. But they're not listed, so on a hardware dedicated to your own use, dedicated hosts, really no limitations apply. It's treated as your own hardware. So bring your own license works there. Virtual machines, if the provider allows you to bring your own license, they must explicitly tell you, yes, you can. Then in that case, the same rules apply to that virtual machine as the on-premises per virtual machine licensing. So treat it as an on-premises machine that you license per VM. So exactly same rules apply. only, well, from the 1st October 2022, but any provider platform. CSP hoster, not CSP hoster, it really doesn't matter. As long as it's not Azure, Alibaba, Google, or AWS, BYOL is now permitted for Windows Server, which is, well, it's a good change. So software assurance consideration or subscription considerations for Windows Server, which you need to keep in mind. What are the licensing benefits of software assurance and subscription versus licenses without it? So firstly, and subscription versus licenses without it. So firstly, Azure hybrid benefit. Secondly, new version rights, which is, well, this is what people usually remember when they tell them software assurance. They're like, oh, this is just new version rights. It's more than that. It's listed on this page and even more. Semi-annual builds, if you need them. Are they still a thing in Windows Server 2022? I don't remember. But for example, if you run semi-annual builds for Windows Server 2016 and you want to continue running them, you must continue paying for software assurance. Otherwise, you would have to reinstall the service. Because semi-annual builds were only allowed for licenses with SA. And it's still the case. Flexible virtualization, the equivalent of license mobility. Remember, virtual machines moving with licenses. SA is required. Bring your own license, unless it's dedicated hardware. So to virtual machines on providers, SA is required. And remember that client access licenses, all the client access licenses must also have software assurance if you want to benefit from these things. So if you want to avoid becoming non-compliant on upgrade or for software assurance benefits, have a say on SaaS, keep it for the per VM license, for bring your own license, for migrating to Azure and whatnot, what's on this slide. So because we get this question, do we actually need to keep paying for a say on Windows Server? If you're using this, or you plan to use this, then yes, you need to pay for software assurance on Windows Server. Otherwise, cancel it. If you have a simple on-premises infrastructure, you don't plan to upgrade, or you do upgrades every 5 years, there's very little reason to pay for a say, unless you want this. So CSP considerations, licenses bought through CSP. Importantly, and I'm surprised I still have to remind this, more people learn, perpetual licenses in CSP do not have software assurance benefits. Only subscriptions have software assurance benefits. And not even software assurance benefits, they call software assurance benefit equivalency. It's partial, but 90% of the benefits are covered. So software assurance does not exist in CSP as a concept. So you either have, on one hand, perpetual licenses to which you never can attach software assurance, and on the other hand, you have subscriptions, which benefit from the majority of SA benefits. Here's a question. If you fancy answering in the chat, I don't require you to do so. So, do you need, just to check whether you were listening, do you need software assurance for Windows Server in virtual clusters so licenses could move along with virtual machines? And if you answered that question in 2019, the answer this year is different. Microsoft changed it. And if you haven't clicked like yet by this time, please click like. You really make my day. I'm not asking to subscribe. I'm not asking to do anything else. Just a simple like would warm my heart. Thank you. And Core Infrastructure Suite. Core Infrastructure Suite is, many companies buy it instead of Windows Server. Why? Because it's a bundle including Windows Server and System Center, with a substantial discount from 5 to 15%, depending on how you buy it. The current editions for CIS, this is the acronym CIS, Core Infrastructure Suite, are standard and Datacenter, and essentially from almost all the licensing rules, it's an equivalent of Windows Server licenses, but also with System Center included. So I'll quickly click through these slides, but what you will notice is that almost every slide says it's the same as Windows Server. So how do you calculate core licenses? The same. The same as Windows Server. Virtualization, same as Windows Server, exactly the same rules. Purchasing core licenses. So what you need to remember is that if you need CIS, it's not yet available in CSP and probably will never be. yet to be seen, because CSP is suddenly getting more love from Microsoft. I wish it had it more. And what you need to remember also is that Core Infrastructure Suite is only sold with software assurance, but software assurance can expire on it, and you can keep the perpetual licenses. So if you want to buy it, you always buy it with the same. Core licenses are sold in packs, 216 core packs, same rules apply. Azure Hybrid benefits. So what's important here is that you may use CIS licenses for Azure Hybrid benefit to cover Windows Server. System Center is more complicated, so the System Center component of CIS it doesn't have Azure Hybrid benefit. Otherwise, all the same rules applies for Windows Server, access the same, all the same. Other off-premises use, same rules applies for Windows Server. That includes bring your own license via flexible virtualization. Sorry. Client access, same rules applies for Windows Server. Software assurance considerations, same as Windows Server. And on this fantastic note, unless you have any more questions, I would like to finish this short training, short and